Hi, and welcome to this core lecture on an introduction to research community called Critical Pedagogy. My name is Shreehan Lynch and I'm the physical education lecturer for teacher education. It's a pleasure that I'm presenting on behalf of my colleague who also runs this research community with me. Her name is Kath Connor. So the aim of today's session is really to give you an introduction as to what critical pedagogy is. So by the end of today's short introduction on critical pedagogy, you should be able to explain it, maybe analyze it, and if interested, do a little bit more further reading on what critical pedagogy is. You might also get some examples on how to go around an active inquiry research project using critical pedagogy. I'm going to share some examples of what other students have done in the past towards the end. I hope you enjoy it. So to begin, we're going to watch a very short video. And if at any point you want to stop, pause, or record the video or this recording, please do. You'll definitely need the time to write down some of your answers. So I want you to watch the video and come up with 10 questions that you have about the content. Like I said, you may need to watch it a couple of times or rewind the recording at any point. So you should have paused that when needed, but you should have around 10 questions, and those questions could be related to capitalism, animal cruelty, the selling of animals, conformity, similarity, lots and lots of different things your questions could be related to. If needed, just watch the video again. Your task now, though, is to narrow your 10 questions down to the 3 you think are most important about the content. Pause the video if needed. Now that you have your 3 most important questions, I have another task for you to do. And that's to decide the most important question that you have and consider why it's the most important question that you have from that video. Pause the video if needed. The reason why I've asked you to do that task and the reason why I've showed you something from Simpsons out of the ordinary is that process of going down, further, coming up with the most important thing to you is a process of deconstruction. And it's a process of critical thinking where you have to rationalize as to why you've come up with certain points. Now, a lot of you might be sitting there thinking, what on earth has this got to do with anything critical pedagogy related? Well, it is important because critical thinking is a huge part of critical pedagogy. And we have to understand critical thinking before we can really delve into critical pedagogy. So critical thinking, we might have something abstract. We might have something that focuses on an individual. It might be contextually neutral or objective. However, our responsibility is to come up with some kind of dialogue or argument, find out new knowledge, and use reasoning and judgment to do that. For example, why is there a unicorn in the video? What was Banksy trying to do or say? Why were bones in the video? What is the purpose of everybody being in rows and lines? Why is that problematic? Now let's have a look at what critical pedagogy is.
Hello, in this video, we're going to meet Paulo Freire, the founder of critical pedagogy. Freire was born in 1921 in Recife, Brazil. His ideas about the role of education in political freedom eventually became some of the most significant contributions to what's now known as critical pedagogy. But to fully understand the context in which he formed his ideas, first we have to know a little bit more about the history of Brazil. Brazil was a Portuguese colony from 1500 to 1822. Even after independence, Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to outlaw slavery in 1888. Well into the 20th century, 85% of Brazil's population was still illiterate, and some still sold themselves or family members into black market slavery to ward off starvation. Freire's family was middle class when he was born, but the economic depression of the 1930s wiped them out. When Paulo was 10, the family had to move to a smaller, cheaper city on the outskirts of Recife. It was nearly a decade before their fortunes improved. Freire later said that he was desperately hungry during these years, which made learning impossible, not due to a lack of interest or ability, but because he was too distracted to focus on anything else. Young Paulo took to stealing in order to feed his family, and eventually had to drop out of elementary school. After his father died of a heart condition exacerbated by poverty and stress in 1934, Freire's mother pleaded with the principal of the local secondary school to allow her son to attend. Because Paulo was passionate about using his education to help others, the principal agreed and even reduced his tuition. With this second chance, Freire eventually studied philosophy while completing his law degree. He began his career in 1942 teaching at the same secondary school he had graduated from. In 1947, Freire became the director of the Department of Education and Culture and began conducting literacy programs for poor adults. It was during this time that he developed his major ideas about the relationship between oppression, literacy, and educational praxis. Freire's educational philosophy harshly criticizes what he terms the banking model of education, which sees students as passive, empty receptacles to be filled by the wise, all-knowing teacher. Freire linked this model of education to the socioeconomic and political relationship between oppressor and oppressed, which he experienced firsthand during his years of poverty and hunger. Building off of Hegel, Marx, and others, Freire's ontology states that the ultimate goal of all persons is to increase, not decrease, their humanity. In the same way that the colonizer thinks his own ways are always best, the teacher who sees students as hollow vessels is participating in a process that discourages critical thought, perpetuates oppression, and dehumanizes both. Rather than the traditional hierarchical model of the relationship between teacher and student, where the teacher is firmly above the student, Freire proposed in his most famous work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, published in 1967, that effective education is built upon a democratic relationship between equals who are open to learning from one another. This teacher-student relationship is what allows conscientização, the critical awareness that precedes action, to develop in oppressed peoples over time. Conscientização begins with students becoming aware of the contradictions in their social, political, economic, gender, race, and class conditions, and then taking action to resolve those contradictions. In Freire's so-called problem-posing education, teachers problematize each issue discussed in class. Students then pose their own solutions. Teacher and students then work together in both goal and process to successfully change the conditions of oppression and ultimately achieve the democratic ideal of freedom and equality for all. Dialogue is the basis for all problem-posing pedagogy and requires solidarity, a sense of equal footing, and mutual respect. Freire wrote in his later works that education is fundamentally an act of love. Among the many educators, philosophers, and activists influenced by Paulo Freire are Bell Hooks, Henry Thoreau, Cornel West, and Jonathan Kozol. Pedagogy of the Oppressed has been translated into 17 languages, and its emancipatory teaching model has been adopted or adapted in many previously colonized countries on every continent on the globe. The Paulo Freire Institute is currently active in 18 countries. Even U.S. educators have attempted to adapt Freire's model, though some find it too controversial. For instance, Pedagogy of the Oppressed is one of the books banned by the state of Arizona. More important than his influence on education, however, is the inspiring influence of Freire's life itself. His insistence on literacy and love in the quest for human freedom has helped free the hearts and minds of thousands of people, including the children and grandchildren of former slaves, and his vision of change is an ongoing source of encouragement and hope for millions around the globe.
So many of you might be thinking, wow, I need to watch that again, which is why the video is here for you to go back and watch. But let's talk about exactly what critical pedagogy now is. So critical pedagogy is grounded on a social and education vision of justice and equality. Because of this, it's constructed on a belief that teaching and education in itself are political acts. So what I choose to teach you and what I choose not to teach you, the teaching styles, pedagogies I adopt are political in themselves. As an example of this, I'm right now doing the banking model. I'm presuming that my students, you, have no or little knowledge on this subject. And I'm filling up the vessel and banking information to you and depositing it. In itself, this is a very conservative ideology. And it presumes that you, as the student, have no knowledge, no previous understanding, or actually, even if you do, that doesn't matter because I've chosen as the authoritarian how to deliver the content to you. Now, many students feel really comfortable with this style of teaching because it's what they've been used to throughout their schooling. So if you choose as the teacher to do different types of teaching, dialogic, group circles, share circles, that might be very different and controversial to them. Another example of maybe setting your classroom up in a democratic way would be setting your classroom expectations with your students. My students in physical education set the expectations of our class cohort before they began the course. And in our day one lectures, we had a conversation about classroom expectations. These were all set from their voices, and this was an example of what they can use in schools. In itself, that's a political act, because I'm saying to them that I value their contributions and I want to hear from them because we're colleagues and equal within this process. We're all learners and we're all educators. I'm seeing my students as humans and human individuals, and I want to alleviate any suffering that they have. Part of this work is really linked to raising their critical consciousness, and we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. So as a critical pedagogue, you would agree to develop and nurture an attitude of empathy and regard for the cultures and the students in which we serve. In East London, we serve an array of communities, and it's up to us to be empathetic and respectful to the communities and the different religious faiths, religious beliefs, races and ethnicities in which we serve our students. It's up to us to foster relationships with those students that protect their human rights and their well-being. We see our students as resources. They come to the classroom or teaching space and they're able to dialogue and share with us. We appreciate human relationships, and that's central to a social and critical pedagogy. And we enable students to use their voices, something that isn't being done in a banking style lecture such as this. So we also agree to engage within social and political aspects of human development, childhood and community. Like I mentioned before, everything we do as a teacher is political. You agree to that if you're a critical pedagogue. We educate for community through community. A really great example of this is religious education as a subject area and discipline. Because of the way the national curriculum is set up, we see religious education set their own national curriculum in their own communities. And folks that are currently studying religious education will be able to explain this to their colleagues when they're in school, if you don't understand. We facilitate an attitude of professional curiosity and critical self-reflection, where we go away and we reflect on our teaching, but we also get students to reflect on their actions and become curious learners. We have a learning process which is meaningful to students' everyday lives. It's all about collaboration, understanding theory and practice, and supporting students to realize their hopes, aspirations, and meeting their own goals. It's a very humanistic pedagogy. So one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, who are you and what's your teaching philosophy? And does critical pedagogy align with why you got into teaching and how you want to teach? So what would research in this community cover? It can cover a lot. Predominantly, some broad research areas might be some of the protected characteristics. So you might look in your subject area how you cater for students with a disability. You might look at disability policies within school. What does equality and diversity mean if you have a disability in your school? Or are they just simply buzzwords? You might also look at how the school's policies on gender reassignment, how they include students, or just within your subject area. You might also look at sex or sexual orientation. How does the school support students that are LGBTQI? How is sex or aspirations of males and females within your subject area? Do computer science students predominantly take up GCSE computer science that are males or females? Why? Do you want to look at that? What could you do in year 9 or year 8 to help students realise that computer science is for every single student in school? More, you might look at broad characteristics of racism, heterosexism, linguicism, ableism, and sexism, classism, and so forth, all of the other different types of isms. So we can look at linguicism and curriculum. Many of our students speak different languages. However, within the British curriculum, English language is predominantly used. Often students are disciplined for speaking in their native tongue. Is there a way in which you can bring different languages into your classroom? Is there a way in which you can share your learning objectives in different languages and have a conversation around that? Is there a way you can bring alternative cultures into the classroom? Can you deliver parts of your lesson in an alternate language? And we see modern foreign languages as a discipline really do this very well. But then we question why we only have predominantly European languages in our schools being taught, such as French and Spanish. So these are the types of questions that we can begin to ask and answer. Another question when we look at our curriculum and we question is we might question, for example, a very controversial thing that's in research quite a lot, is why does William Shakespeare feature so much in the English curriculum? Many of William Shakespeare's stories completely make fun of and they exploit classist subjects. So for example, if you were from a low socioeconomic status, in many of Shakespeare's stories and his plays, they were seen as very low down and they were made fun of. Also, his stories invoke misogynist views and ideologies around women, and they tell very heterosexual stories of Romeo and Juliet, male and female. So if you are an English trainee, you might be questioning some of these things and you might be questioning the curriculum. Let me give you another example of what another student has looked at. For example, how do we perpetuate racism in school? You might want to look at school policies. An example of a potentially racist policy could be ensuring that all students have their hair to a certain grade level. We know this is potentially problematic in Black communities, in which having your hair at a grade 1 or lower might be appropriate, or having your hair styled in a certain type of way that can be seen as different to a normative culture, a white culture. For example, hair braiding or afro hair. Now, question, what does somebody's hairstyle matter to how they learn? And many of you will have lots of ideas around that, and many of you will have very different ideas around that. It's about establishing what is right for our students and how they learn, and why certain policies have been put in place in the first place, often dictated by those in privileged elite positions. We'll look at that a little bit further in the research community to help you understand it a little bit more. Other inquiry options could be as simple as the organisational structure of your class. Now, largely, this is going to be dictated by COVID moving forward, but having students in rows and lines is a very banking type of structure. It doesn't invoke student dialogue and conversation and student sharing. So you might just do an inquiry project looking at the different ways you can set your classroom up and the structures that you have in your class. Rather than doing lectures like this one, you might explore different types of methods used in class. For example, poetry, silent galleries, artwork, drawing on practical things that you can do, student-led assignments and inquiry. You might explore different types of assessment that promote student dialogue and move away from students simply answering questions and writing a test. And you might include content that spreads any protected characteristic or type of ism. For example, including within your class content, for example, drawing on the diversity performance in Britain's Got Talent, which was linked to Black Lives Matters. You can play around with content that links to, in this example, it's in physical education. You can use that as a theme in dance. You might also play with content, for example, if you were a drama student, and you might show a political type of act, and then you might play with forum theatre and ask students to act and create the rest of that story. They're just a couple of examples. Let's take a look now at some other examples from last year. Last year, we ran a sociocultural research community, which draws on critical pedagogy a lot. So their examples are still relevant, but just bear that in mind when looking through. So to begin with, this is an example from DT, and this is a fantastic project did by Sasha, who looked at increasing the ambition of young girls in her school. She worked at an all-girls school, and she looked at sexism and gender equality, which might lead to low ambition. She found in this research project that a lot of students weren't really sure what they wanted to do and achieve. So she implemented an intervention to help them and show them creative things they might do when they leave school, based on people from their local community. You're welcome to pause this slide if you want to look at what she did a little bit more. Next was Rosie, who was a biology trainee. She looked at bridging the gender gap. Can gender role models influence pupils' ideologies of scientists? The aim of her active inquiry was to motivate and engage all pupils via positive underrepresentation role models, and to highlight the presence of females in STEM subjects. So initially, she asked students to draw a scientist, and predominantly they drew white males. She did lots and lots of work with them, and at the end of her active inquiry project, as you can see over here, they drew an array of scientists, and they came to a realization that actually both sexes or any genders can become scientists. Some more examples. So Farida in geography looked at using poetry and rap during geography inquiry to help disadvantaged pupils. So she drew on knowledge that they knew about and were aware of, and they listened in their own lives within their own communities. And she found that actually it was really helpful and helped the students learn content more by using poetry and rap during class. Bianca looked at motivating boys in MFL, and she looked at certain tasks and methods and pedagogies that she could put in place to motivate young boys within her class. Alice, in physical education, looked at increasing the participation of Muslim female secondary school students. And she did this through a negotiated curriculum and a faith-considerate environment. She found that actually it was really helpful going through the process of creating the lessons, and she interviewed students and asked them, how do we make physical education more inclusive to your faith? All very worthwhile, engaging, and quite simply amazing projects to be ran in school. Hopefully, if you take the research community, you'll get lots more ideas of things that you can do in your own subject area. You might have some further reading that you want to do, and I've put a couple of books on here for you to go and investigate and look at in your own time. This really has just been an introduction to critical pedagogy. The fundamentals of critical pedagogy are dialogue, knowledge sharing, moving away from a banking approach, problem posing education, asking questions, critical thinking, and raising critical consciousness. Feel free to watch the videos, engage in any of this content anymore, or do a simple library search and type in critical pedagogy and your subject area to look at research that's been done. For example, critical pedagogy and maths. See what comes up in your subject area and what research studies have been done. That might give you a few ideas on what you can do as a research project. I wish you all the best, no matter which research community you choose. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.